Now, I'm pleased to introduce Nathalie Hérold, who is a musicologist and a musician. She is a research engineer at l'ABEX GREAM, researcher at ACCRA laboratory at the University of Strasbourg. She is vice president of the French Society of Music Analysis, SFAM, and member of the French Society of Musicology, SFM. She is also co-editor-in-chief of the journal Musurgia for Analyse and Practice Musicale, and editor-in-chief of the journal Music in Action. Nathalie has a PhD in music from the University of Strasbourg and a license in mathematics, as well as the National Diploma for Teaching Music specialized in piano. His research works are mainly focused on the role of timbre in musical forms in the 19th and 12th centuries. She is interested in musical timbre from an analytical and theoretical point of view, while considering the musical production and reception process specific to the latter. His work is part of an interdisciplinary perspective and also includes a space for reflection dedicated to popular music. Nathalie will present a text about description and analysis of timbre between scores and recordings, thinking from the instrumental music of the 19th and 12th centuries.
Thank you, Laurent, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone. So before starting, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, in particular Laurent Potier, for the invitation. And I would like to say also that the program of this conference looks very interesting because of the diversity of approaches, which seem to me are really promising. So in relation to the theme and general argument of the conference, I would like to consider the description and analysis of timbre on the basis of my experience of 19th and 20th century instrumental repertoires of Western art music. In connection with the idea of fixed music, my reflection will focus on the objects that reveal useful in order to pursue a timbre-based analysis, which include in these repertoires scores as written objects, as well as sound objects like recordings. My general argument is that, first point, a timbre analysis is relevant and enlightening in the context of 19th and 20th century instrumental repertoires. Second point, in these repertoires, timbre can be analyzed according to a score, but recordings as sound objects also play a crucial role. And third point, a timbre-based analytical approach should be developed on the basis of the idea of a sound paradigm, characteristic of contemporary music practices, but deeply rooted in a tradition and a transmission of timbre that go back at least to the beginning of the 19th century. To discuss these issues, I take the point of view of music analysis and theory. In France, we would generally speak of analytical musicology. My reflection also includes aspects related to musical practice, as I am myself a pianist, as well as interdisciplinarity in relation to psychology, also acoustics and computer sciences. So during the remainder of this talk, I will discuss, first of all, as a preliminary stage, the nature of timbre and the notion of timbre analysis. Then the role of scores in timbre analysis, and finally the complementary role of recordings for the analysis of timbre in music. What is timbre? It seems to me important to begin with a clarification of what is covered by the concept of timbre on the basis of my own research. One should keep in mind the fact that the definition of timbre remains in any case an open issue. This was one of the main conclusions at the Montreal Timbre 2018 conference, along with the observation of a lack of a unified and common shared conception, and thus the necessity to provide definitional elements in each context in order to avoid misunderstandings. A first point concerns terminological aspects, in which two main uses of the term timbre can be distinguished. On the one hand, timbre, in its etymological use, refers to a proper characteristic of a musical instrument in the sense of an instrumental differentiation. On the other, timbre, in its metaphorical use, characterizes the sound itself, making thus possible to consider the overall timbre produced by a group of instruments, for example, the timbre or timbres of the orchestra, as well as to differentiate the multiple timbres that can be produced by a sole instrument, for example, the timbres of the piano or of the clarinet, as we saw yesterday. In this sense, Michel Castellengo differentiates identity timbre from qualitative timbre, which constitute different ways of listening, the latter playing a crucial role in musical practice. A second point is about dimensionality and the relation of timbre to other musical dimensions or parameters. From a psychological perspective, everyone knows the definition of the American Standards Association, according to which, I quote, timbre is that attribute of auditory sensation in terms of which a listener can judge that two sounds similarly presented and having the same loudness and pitch are dissimilar. This definition characterizes timbre by default, by what it is not, rather than by what it is. We already spoke about that yesterday. It also postulates the dependence or correlation of timbre to other auditory attributes, such as loudness and pitch, so that these latter have to remain constant in order to access timbre properties without any disturbance. From a compositional and musical perspective, the issue of dependence to other parameters is formulated in a somewhat different way. As Schoenberg noticed in 1911, I quote, the tone becomes perceptible by virtue of tone color, of which one dimension is pitch. Tone color is thus the main topic, pitch a subdivision. Pitch is nothing else but tone color measured in one direction. Schoenberg raises the notion of timbre at a higher level than pitch, considered here as one aspect of timbre among others. This conception opens up interesting theoretical perspectives. More recently, Hugues Dufour proposed to regard timbre not as a mere color of sound, but as a meta-parameter that can integrate all musical parameters. This idea of multidimensionality, more precisely metadimensionality, is a way to consider timbre in terms of complexity at the level of music itself, not only as one component among others. A third point of interest to me concerns the musical use of timbre in conjunction with the idea of not of timbre in general, but of musical timbre, which I relate to musical practices pertaining to orchestration or even voicing, which has no real terminological equivalent in French language. Several definitions of the notion of orchestration have been in particular. I quote, the art of combining the sounds of a complex of instruments, an orchestra or other ensemble, to form a satisfactory blend or balance. Another definition by Émilie Dolan, orchestration is the art of manipulating instrumental timbre. And by Stephen McAdams, orchestration involves the choice, combination, or juxtaposition of sounds to achieve a musical end. These definitions highlight the idea of orchestration as distribution and organization of timbre and instrumental sound material, considered as an art with its specific techniques. It can be linked to the notion of voicing as on one or several instruments, with an emphasis on the type of sound quality, instrument, register, etc. a given note will be affected to. This relatively broad definition makes it in particular possible to support the idea of a specific pianistic orchestration regarded as the art of manipulating piano timbre. What is then timbre analysis? Here also, I present the conceptions that underlie my reflection and research in terms of analysis and analytical practices that are likely to cover different meanings depending on the disciplines under consideration. First of all, my research on timbre is conceived as part of the field of music analysis and theory, which can be defined respectively as, I quote, that part of the study of music that takes as its starting point the music itself rather than external factors. More formally, analysis may be said to include the interpretation of structures in music, together with the resolution into relatively simpler constituent elements and the investigation of the relevant functions of those elements. And another definition, more recent definition of music theory, which is an area of study that tends to focus on musical signals per se in order to explain and or offer generalizations about their various principles and processes. It investigates how these materials function, or in a more speculative vein, how they might function, so that musical structure can be better understood. I think you all know these passages, which remind us of the importance given to musical materials, structures, as well as functions in the context of a specific piece, or more generally as regards musical languages. Music analysis and theory have been traditionally and primarily focused on pitch organization systems and correlatively on scores and score-based music, generally from the Common Practice period. The consideration of sound and timbre aspects goes back to the end of the 1970s, especially in North American music theory, even earlier than in France, in particular at ACCRA. It also included famous discussions on whether timbre is to be considered as a secondary parameter or not. So this evolution was also strongly related to a general opening of the analytical reflection to musical repertoires, including electroacoustic, popular and traditional music, as well as to interdisciplinary dialogue and technological tools. I do not go into further details because I already developed these ideas in several publications. So nevertheless, these new perspectives had a relatively limited impact on the field of music analysis and theory itself. So my second point about timbre analysis concerns the central idea of my research, which deals not with timbre in general, but with the structural function of timbre in music. In other words, the relation between timbre and musical form. And in this perspective, I must say that I was very interested by the paper given yesterday on the question of timbre and form in Ravel's Rhapsody Espagnole. This issue of timbre and form has been developed in line with analytical and theoretical concepts, such as the ideas of structural levels, formal units, as well as the notion of hierarchy, and constitutes, in this sense, a contribution to formal theory. In addition, this question remains closely connected to psychological related issues formulated by Stephen McAdams in terms of timbre as a form-bearing dimension, and more recently, the structuring force of timbre in music. So this interdisciplinary convergence seems to me promising because with the obvious connections with perception and the cognition sciences. As a third and last point regarding timbre analysis, I would like to say a few more words about the idea of timbre description and its particular function within the timbre analytical process. So from my own experience, timbre description is closely related to observation as a first stage of timbre analysis. It includes the idea of verbalization through specific terminologies and taxonomies. This description process is essential in order to identify analytical categories pertaining to the timbre dimension of music that may possibly be integrated within a formalized system. Description implies a medium transposition or even transcription that reveals crucial for the activities of segmentation, comparison, and the search for rules that constitute the core of the analytical process. This applies in particular to timbre analysis, with a final stage in an interpretation of the identified structures in terms of musical relevance. I now move on to the discussion of score regarding written objects that can be used as a support to timbre analysis, in the sense of a, so to speak, score-based timbre analysis. I repeat that these considerations apply specifically to the case of 19th and 20th century instrumental music. Generally speaking, analyzing timbre through scores requires the identification of indicators or factors within the score, taking into account the fact that timbre, contrary to pitch and duration, is not always written in an explicit and direct manner. The specificity of instrumental timbre notation has to be taken into account. As mentioned by Caroline Traub, I quote, "Notation is at various levels, before or after the gesture-sound relationship. The composer can decide to note the cause, gesture, fingering, the sound effect to be produced, type of attack, roundness of sound, or specify its impact on the listener, character. This decoding of instrumental scores in terms of timbre is also worth considering in relation to the instrumental possibilities themselves. In any case, scores are here regarded as mediums of a symbolic representation of timbre in the line of Bukolchev's idea of écriture du timbre, which refers to a process of timbre notation as a basis of timbre composition, in the particular case of score-based music. A first kind of methodological tool I developed in the context of score-based timbre analysis refers to the notions of spectral harmony and spectral melody. In connection with vertical spacing as a timbre factor, these can be studied through the symbolic notation of the score, keeping in mind the fact that, I quote here Bregman, if the auditory system detects a series of partials with harmonic relations, it will group them into one sound whose pitch will be calculated. In other words, harmonicity favors auditory fusion. This phenomenon can be extended to polyphonic cases where simultaneous sounds can be analyzed in relation to their conformity to harmonic spectrums, as is the case in Debussy's prelude, The Girl with the Flaxen Hair. In this piece, I pointed out some passages where a decomposition into what I call explicit fundamentals is useful to understand the impact of the choices in terms of voicing on the structural organization of timbre. In other terms, to identify what is likely to sound together and even reinforce each other, and what will remain outside the overall sound with specific timbre properties. This is the case of measures 28 and 30, as you can see on the figure. I have a sound example. You can try to. About this passage, moreover, it was for me particularly interesting to notice here at a higher structural level of the same piece that the two climaxes of the piece in terms of maximum pitch range precisely corresponded to the two passages of maximum resonance and timbral fusion identified by the analysis. And the passage, the previous passage presented in the previous slide is here the second one, so climax number 2. So there is a link between different here structural levels of the form, which is very interesting. The notion of spectral melody is also based on such types of spacing and harmonicity considerations, but this time in close relation with the sympathetic resonance phenomenon of the piano. Considering melody from a spectral perspective does consist in analyzing the harmonic relations of a melody with its general sound context. In Chopin's Prelude, Opus 9, number 2, for example, the first harmony can be analyzed in different ways. The presence of one common implicit fundamental gives account to the overall consistency of this harmonic configuration. The decomposition into two explicit fundamentals, the analysis in the middle of the slide, makes it possible to understand the inner timbral structure of the chord. And the analysis in terms of spectral doubling, which you can see on the right of the figure, bottom right, aims at identifying the sounds of the accompanying parts that are activating the melodic upper part through the presence of common partials. This phenomenon is indeed as tested by experience, because every good pianist tries in this piece to control the left-hand part in order to design a regular and singing right-hand melodic part. So here, for example, the upper G, G5, is activated by 4 notes of the accompaniment of the left hand. And also, I have here an example just to remember the beginning of this nocturne, but I think you already know it. This is a recording I made at the Strasbourg Conservatory. I made it myself with in collaboration with the pianist who is teaching at the Strasbourg Conservatory. So you hear that the nocturne here is based on a particular texture of accompanied melody. And due to this characteristic, the entire piece was systematically analyzed using the same method I exposed earlier. So the results were presented in this figure. They highlight different vertical profiles that may activate the melodic notes with an impact of their timbral properties. So it's a sort of timbre analysis of the upper melody, but considering the spectral doublings created by the accompanying part. So the analysis showed that the vertical structure with maximum activation is constituted by 5 simultaneous spectral doublings, and this is present only once in the piece at measure 10. So this point is particularly interesting to notice in terms of formal analysis. A second kind of score-based timbre analysis I would like to present has been developed in the context of the ACCRA project on the basis of Stephen McAdams' taxonomy of orchestral grouping effects. So the categories are here derived from auditory scene analysis. To become operational for the analysis of orchestral music, the 3 main types of auditory groupings, concurrent, sequential, and segmental, were interpreted in terms of resulting perceptual qualities and orchestral effects, as you can see on the figure on the right. So I go a little fast on this taxonomy because it has already been commented and you can find publications on it. So this system of different level of categories and subcategories is used for the annotation of musical scores with colored boxes. And during the annotation process, the analyst is provided with a recording of the piece as a reference sound object. The systematic character of the procedure allows an implementation within the OrgView software, which we are currently testing on the basis of a selection of orchestral pieces from the classical to the modern period. And it will be also possible to export the annotations into an online database. So I recently also, on the basis of this taxonomy, I used this taxonomy to opus 106. And the figure here showed the first 2 pages of the annotated score in terms of blending, segregation into streams, stratification, etc. So here, after this first descriptive phase, it was possible for me to shed light on some aspect of the formal organization of the movement, which is really interesting. My analysis established in particular that the first thematic group in F-sharp minor was characterized by a surface texture dominant effect, that is an integration grouping effect that emphasizes a perception of sonic fusion. Without going into further detail, we can point out here the particular role of a score-based timbre analysis in order to consider the correlations between the tonal thematic dimension of the movement, here a sonata form, and its timbral dimension as a result, in this case, of orchestral grouping effects, giving rise to what I call dominant timbre effect. So if we have time, I have a little, the beginning of the movement to hear it. the slow movement. It's a slow movement of the sonata. It's a very long movement. In a complementary way, I would still like to discuss now recordings considered as sound objects that make it possible to consider music beyond notes and notation. And recordings constitute, for me, another gateway as well as support to timbre analysis in the sense of a recording-based timbre analysis. Generally speaking, recordings are particularly useful to timbre analysis as fixed sound objects that favor reproducibility. As mentioned by François Delalande, I quote, "The acoustic wave, as long as it is not fixed by a recording, is not appropriate for observation. Analysis requires reproducibility." Reproducibility looks particularly crucial as regards repeated as well as implemented listening that are fully part of timbre analysis. Some challenges have to be mentioned as regards the use of recordings for timbre analysis purposes. A first is about the technological context of the recordings themselves that should be submitted to critical examination. The focus on contemporary practices looks relatively evident. In addition, the self-production of recordings for research purposes through collaborations with musicians can be a solution to control the recording protocols. Another point lies in the variability of sound sources for a same piece, in relation to the interpretation choices made by the musicians that have an impact on the resulting timbres. Nevertheless, the study of the formal use of timbre leads to the identification of formal invariants that are resistant to interpretation changes, in particular through comparisons and possibly the search for irregularities or even mean values. Finally, one of the main benefits of such a recording-based timbre analysis lies in the opportunities for communication with analytical methods developed in reference to other musical corpus in the sense of a methodological transfer. I'm thinking in particular of electroacoustic music, as my research was very much inspired by Stéphane Roy's L'analyse des musiques électroacoustiques, the analysis of electroacoustic music. So first kind of methodological development in the context of recording-based timbre analysis concerned the application of the Gestalt theory to the representation of musical form, following in particular Roy's methodological propositions. This analytical method, which concerns here score-based music, is grounded on a sonogram representation of the piece, considered as a visual support to oral analysis. The method consists in the elaboration of a graphic transcription of a piece based on the associated sonogram, where perceptually relevant timbre patterns are identified. Such a graphic representation, which could be compared to a sort of mental image of the piece, highlights particular formal processes like distance relations or internal symmetries between formal elements that can hardly be highlighted by a score-based analysis. So applied, for example, to Muray's Territoire de l'oubli, the Gestaltic analysis gives rise to the analytical representation reproduced here. The graphic transcription of the entire piece shows here two types of timbre patterns that have been connected to specific musical elements of the score. On the basis of this transcription, the piece has been divided on the upper level of structure into four main sections named E1 to D2. The two timbrally contrasted first sections, which present respectively a discrete iterate figure and a continuous one, have the function of presenting the piece's timbre material. The development sections, also occupying contrasting time and frequency spans, are both built on the same formal model, using the two timbre patterns presented earlier. D1 and D2 show a progression in both proportion and structural elaboration. On the one hand, D1 operates a temporal dilatation, and on the other, D2 gives rise to a vertical as well as horizontal dilatation that maintains the global proportions of the resonance figure. So this corresponds to a remarkable change of scaling based on the principle of the recursion of musical form, here in the case of a spectral music piece. Another example is the case of Chopin's Berceuse. I also showed through this method that the structure in series of variations that arises from a traditional score-based analysis diverges from the overall symmetrical structure highlighted by a timbre-based analysis. This analysis was based on a research recording elaborated in collaboration with the pianist from the Strasbourg Conservatory, but the structure was also confirmed by analysis based on other recordings, so that it cannot be said to be performance dependent. In my analysis, I was also interested in going deeper into the understanding of the corresponding symmetrical units from a score-based perspective. In any case, these results are inseparable from the use of a sonogram representation, which makes it easier to put the timbral units in relation to each other. As we see, such a systematic re-examination of the score-based repertoire can lead to the reconsideration of the theories of classical and romantic forms. So a last aspect of recording-based timbre analysis concerns the use of audio features, in particular the brightness or spectral centroid, in order to highlight some aspects related to the formal use of timbre in music. Due to its primary role in the recognition and characterization of instrumental timbre, brightness can be considered as a timbral and more general musical relevant parameter. We saw that in several papers yesterday. As mentioned by Malte and Journon, John Gray highlighted the fact that brightness was one of the three main parameters for the characterization of timbre. This idea was then reinforced and developed in particular by the studies of Wessel and McAdams, and more recently, several studies have shown the relevance of the use of brightness as one of the 10 most important descriptors for the identification of instrumental timbre and as a good estimator of the perceived spectral brightness. Brightness revealed very interesting in one of my analyses of Beethoven's Piano Sonata Opus 111, a second movement. I had previously established the function of measure 116 and 17 as the timbral and tonal articulation point of the overall movement. And that was also questioned by Michael Levinas' following comment as a pianist, which interprets this passage in terms of timbre and microtonality. He writes about it, if we carefully listen to this lower B flat, we can observe that the frequency of the note falls very slowly due to the evolution of the harmonics and the envelope of the sound. I therefore decided to analyze this passage using the linear frequency centroid VAMP plugin of the Sonic Visualizer software. The results showed indeed a significant fall of the spectral centroid in the two recordings submitted to analysis, one by Michael Levinas, the other by Alfred Brendel. And even the fact that the two pianists manage in two different ways this passage. I have here a recording of the passage by Levinas. Where the decrease of brightness is very clear to the ear, and another recording by Brendel, which manages the passage a little bit differently. So without going into further details here, these observations highlight the limits of the symbolic notation in comparison to its timbral realization at a strategic moment of the formal structure of the Beethoven movement. And a last example here at a higher structural level, because I also used the log frequency centroid to support an analysis of a Liszt piece titled Andante Lacrimoso. And here also data have been produced using the same Sonic Visualizer plugin, then processed via a spreadsheet program. We see that the shape of the curve confirmed the segmentation into three main sections that I had also established earlier using other representations and methods, in particular register and pitch range analysis, and gave rise to interpretations in terms of long-term organization of the piece, for which the spectral centroid seemed here relevant. So generally speaking, this type of representation provides a quantitative basis to analysis and opens the way to aspects of timbre related to long-term formal considerations. Some concluding remarks. First of all, I focused in this talk on the objects of timbre analysis, and I would like to stress again the role of both scores and recordings and their complementarity for the development of timbre-based analytical methods of 19th and 20th century instrumental music. Second point, the few analyses and methods I commented on show some aspects of timbral coherence and continuity among instrumental pieces from this wide range of time, in line with the idea of a sound paradigm or even timbre paradigm rooted somewhere in the Romantic period or perhaps even earlier. And third and last point, I would like to mention that you can find further details on the analysis presented here very quickly in different publications, and that I am currently pursuing this research in the context of the ACCRA project on timbre and orchestration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for this nice presentation.
I'll stop sharing it.
Is there some question? Yes, Claudia?
Yes, thank you, Nathalie. I like your example of Levinas against Brendel. Could you, that obvious when I heard it, probably because of the sound quality as well, but I was wondering, do you have any idea what did the two performers did differently? Is that a question of timing, not putting the note exactly at the same time, or is that one doing a decrescendo a bit more than the others? Or
I studied this acoustic analysis in relation to the score, and I noticed that you know, there is a trill on the right hand, and Brendel manages differently the trill. If you remember, there is a specific notation of Beethoven. You have the low E flat on the left hand, and Beethoven writes a decrescendo on one note, which is a little bit striking because you can't make a decrescendo on one note. But this I relate this to Caroline Straub's reflection on timbre notation. You know, timbre notation can be also a notation of the effect. So I'm sure that can be interpreted like. But on the upper part, the trill part of the right hand, you have also